if you're like these folks and you are all in on mass deportation, or even if you know someone who is, you are going to want to hear this. And this is important because just in September, a poll showed that 54% of Americans support mass deportation, including 25% of Democrats. But that's only until they've been told the consequences of that plan. And I am now well equipped to tell you those consequences because I just attended a fascinating webinar with the American Immigration Council in which they did a deep dive on how this policy will affect our economy. And it's called Mass Deportation, Devastating Cost to America, Its Budget, and Economy. Let's just go over the top lines. So first, how many people is Trump talking about deporting? Well, he says 10 million, he says 20 million, he says 30 million undocumented people. There's not actually that many undocumented people in the country. The study uses a very research-based number, 13.3 million. This number doesn't include people who came to the US through parole programs. They are here legally. Trump still wants to deport them as well. And also, Trump wants to deport now naturalized citizens as well. This is something called remigration. You should Google it. But again, this study just looks at undocumented people, 13.3 million of them. Now, the first thing to know is that we have no system in place for going out and rounding up all of those people. That doesn't exist. ICE doesn't do that. They find undocumented people when they come into the law enforcement system. So that system would need to be created out of whole cloth. So going into communities and arresting people turns out to be extremely expensive. ICE would need to hire about 31,000 more agents, and this part, just the arresting, would cost about $7 billion a year. So next is the cost of actually detaining these people, because we only right now have the capacity to detain about 40,000 undocumented people at a time. So what Trump wants to do would require detaining about 1 million people at a time, and that would require them to build massive tent structures down by the border. Those are incredibly expensive to build. Then there's the cost of legal proceedings, because before someone can be deported, there has to be a removal order. That's a court case. That's the law. There are already 3.7 million cases pending in immigration court, so you would have to hire new ICE prosecutors, new courtrooms, new staff, new judges. Then there is the cost of removal itself, and this is setting aside the logistical difficulties that half of the countries these people come from will not take them back. So we have to find third countries that will take them. Hugely difficult. Then the cost. So the ICE director in a hearing last year said that one single flight hour of an ICE deportation flight costs $17,000. So multiply that by these millions of people. They're saying the removal process, the average flight cost, ground transportation, all that, $21 billion to remove 1 million immigrants annually. They also said to bear in mind that right now there is a plane shortage, there is a pilot shortage. We have never in the history of our country deported more than 230,000 people in a year, ever. But Trump is saying that we're going to do 10 million in a year? It is logistically impossible. For all the reasons I've just stated, it cannot actually happen. But let's say that it could. These people decided to analyze what would that cost. Let's say you could do it. And they found it would cost $350 billion just for the deportation, not its impact on the economy. So then they analyzed it the other way. Let's say they do 1 million people a year. How much is that going to cost? Well, it turns out that is 3 times as expensive. Now, again, this is much more likely the way they'd have to do it. If we did it that way, how much would it cost? $967.9 billion, almost $1 trillion, and that's if inflation stays at 2.9%, which if Trump is elected, it won't. And of course, there are the costs to the morale and the psyche of the country, the mass trauma that will be caused by the family separations. Law enforcement, military, National Guard, moving through cities, going into households, ripping apart, because remember, many of these families are mixed, right? Undocumented people live with citizens. Their children are citizens. So we're talking mass family separation, and also our law enforcement and our military being focused not on their jobs, but on this massive deportation. Now let's look at what it will do to our economy. Our GDP would shrink by between 1.1 and 2.2 trillion dollars. That's between 4 and 6% shrinkage in our GDP. 4.3% shrinkage was what we had during the Great Recession. So we're looking at a recession. Tax revenues will fall 29 billion in the states and 46 billion federal taxes gone. Undocumented immigrants also contribute $22.6 billion to Social Security and 5.7 billion to Medicare. All that money gone. And think about this. Construction and agriculture are both going to lose 1 in 8 workers. Think about what that's going to do to housing prices and food prices. Hospitality is going to lose 1 in 14 workers. Think about what that's going to do to tourism. The restaurant industry will be gutted, and childcare, forget it. Now, the last thing I'll tell you is they also looked at what would happen if you did the opposite of Trump's plan. Putting undocumented immigrants on a pathway to citizenship, which is what Kamala Harris wants to do, would increase U.S. GDP by $1.7 trillion over 10 years. It would raise wages for all Americans, and it would create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Do you see why Trump's plan is not only impracticable, but stupid? So what these signs really should say: tank our economy now, because that's what they mean. Not so psyched about waving that sign? Good. Then for God's sake, don't vote for it.